Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L coming in to talk about ReZero episode 13, the final episode before we go into the break, and then I think ReZero comes back in 2021. Anyway, hey, welcome. As you can see, the video is titled a bit differently. We're doing a different format that I used to do on the channel before I moved on to the next channel that now got deleted. Top moments. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to give you my top moments, and then we're going to talk about my top moments, then we're going to move into general notes. It just helps streamline the video a little bit more. And it's also very good for the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, for me, the top moments of the episode for me were specifically Minerva calling Subaru out, Satella saying what it is that she wants for Subaru, 3, the witches all trying to help Subaru in their own unique ways, because that was pretty neat. 4, Roswell revealing his role and everything and what exactly he wants and what he's doing behind the scenes. And 5, the scene at the end where Otto punches out Subaru and reminds him of the message of the episode. And then I had a bonus moment in there. And so for me, what makes these top moments the top moments is there is a particular idea that I think is conveyed in a lot of those moments, and it's just very interesting to talk about. It's a very particular idea about how ReZero works. And I think it's worth exploring because all those 5 moments together all come together to really paint a particular picture about ReZero, and it's just one that's really fun to talk about. Now, mind you, I am going to be super critical of ReZero because even though Subaru learns a lesson, or he's told a lesson, because we can question whether or not he's learned the lesson by the end of the episode. You know, he's gotten a lesson. The biggest thing that Subaru gets out of this episode is that he learned that people care about him. Which is kind of weird to think about when you consider, like, oh, well, he knows that Rem cares about him, but it's a different thing. He hasn't realized that people care about him. So, you know, that is the biggest value, that people actually do care. But the way people go about talking about this, I don't think it's the best way it could have been done. And I think one thing that you will see is that the witches should not be trusted in any which way. In a lot of ways, the witches are very insane. The only thing here is, like, it's very hard to tell whether or not this is intentional or this is a byproduct of the way that ReZero is structured, in which case I think it's a little bit critical. Now, mind you, I'm going to go through this, and I'm arguing very much for the witches are insane. I'm going to give you points, and my idea with those points is to just tell you, well, why would you ever believe the witches? Now, mind you, the witches had good points, but their good points are legitimately only there because Subaru has so many bad points. And that is something that was also very consistent throughout the moments. But we'll talk about that in the general notes. Anyway, starting off with the first top moment, Minerva calling Subaru out. I got to my notes here. So Minerva's whole premise, I think, is fundamentally flawed. She goes in saying, so you're just going to keep dying, starting over, and making everyone cry. Really? Now, the first thing with that particular line is like, yo, Minerva, as far as I'm aware, no one's confirmed whether or not there's a multiverse going on here. As far as we know, there's only one path that Subaru keeps redoing. So, in that case, those crying people might not even exist. Pretty ballsy for Minerva to come in here using something that legitimately the only person who would have any idea of knowing is the Witch of Envy. Very ballsy for her to come in with that. So I would say on that first fundamental premise, that's based on speculation. Don't be swayed by Minerva's talking point. This isn't an issue of making people cry. This is just a natural consequence of Subaru not being competent. He's going to die many more times in the future. That much is guaranteed. And I'm not saying that because I read the ahead in a light novel. I actually haven't. I haven't read of any future Subaru deaths. I just know that given that this is ReZero, it's going to happen, and this episode proves that that is still the case. And we move on. Minerva's points are terrible here. Minerva saying that Subaru deciding he's the only one that needs to suffer is cowardly. Now think about that. The Subaru thinking he is the only one that needs to suffer is cowardly. Why would she say that? Well, she would say that because other people can also decide to suffer too, or you might have to deal with that. But let's think about that rhetoric. Is the idea that deciding that you're the only one that needs to suffer, is that cowardly? You know, I recall a story about this guy who went through a whole heck of torture, even ended up being crucified, ended up with a hole in his gut. And I remember, like, one of the morals of that story being this guy sacrificed himself to save other people from their sins. Oh, but I guess he was a coward, right? Like, he took on all that suffering to try and absolve some people of their sins there. Oh, he must have been a coward. Shit. That's news to me. And then, what about in traditional stories, heroes? What about a person who goes out to help people because he doesn't want them to suffer? Like, he wants to save 50 people from a burning bus because it's like, I'd rather be the only one that suffers and not you. What about real life heroes? What about firefighters? Like, essentially that mentality of like, you know, I'm going to put myself in danger so that you don't have to. What about them? What about the people that go off to the military and they're always talking like, you know, I'm going out there because I don't want my family to be hurt. Mind you, it's not the same as everyone. Like, I'm, you know, not the everyone, but like the root thought is the same. What is the difference between Subaru and a child who saw a dog coming to attack his sister and got in the way of the dog because he was thinking he was the only one that needed to be hurt? That's the same kind of rhetoric we've seen. What is the difference between Subaru and a kid like that? Is that kid a coward for thinking that he's the only one that needs to suffer? And mind you, you might think like, well, no, these are smaller situations. Like for a guy in the military, it's not just him that's suffering. There's also more people in this group. But isn't that idea, the idea that I'm the only one that needs to suffer because I'm the one of the people that can deal with this, doesn't that idea naturally develop into what Subaru has if he has the power? Like for instance, in the situation of the kid protecting his sister from a dog, you have that mentality. What stops that kid from making more choices like that? Eventually, when you make enough of those choices, you eventually have a situation like Subaru. That one choice or that one instance will inform all the other instances. And we have to remember, like even in Subaru's situation, people are still getting hurt. Even when he's going for his best routes, people are still getting hurt. He's decided that if he can avoid it, he's going to step up. Now, mind you, Subaru does go too far, and they are right to criticize that because at some point he feels like it's his responsibility. But at the same time, I don't think it's correct that saying Subaru deciding he's the only one that needs to suffer is cowardly. I don't think that's correct. At the very least, I don't think that's properly expressed, because the mentality of thinking that your suffering can save other people from their suffering is an honorable mentality that many people have. Even if we were thinking like from reincarnation theory might still want people to suffer, but if you go out and you prevent someone else's suffering and you take it on yourself, that's not going to get you any negative karma. That's only going to help you burn through your own karma. And maybe that's going to have some kind of karmic effect on the other person, but that's still not a cowardly rhetoric. I think Minerva is very much incorrect here. At the very least, I don't think she properly expressed things here, because again, there are points that are worthy of criticizing Subaru on. I don't think this is just an issue of cowardice. Now we move on to my second top moment, that being what Satella says she wants from Subaru. What we get from this moment is that ultimately Satella just really loves Subaru, and honestly, it was a really cool moment. Like all the Satella moments I think were really cool, but Satella's moment continues showing how out of touch the witches are when it comes to Subaru. So the great thing that comes out of this is again the dichotomy. Now again, I want to note Subaru talks himself into a bad position here. For instance, this shot where he says everything bad only happens to him. You know, that's technically incorrect. He's definitely taking the brunt of it, but he's not the only one suffering in the world. Like the world of ReZero sucks. So Subaru's breakdown here is definitely what justifies him needing to be talked to a little bit more though. But I think what ended up happening here is that the writer went hard in making Subaru have verbal flubs in order to justify the witch's insanity in general. I think that's what the writer did. They had to talk up Subaru in order to make everything else more justifiable. Anyway, I do think that Subaru makes a good point in this moment though, that, you know, would anything be different? And then he makes a good point that he would be stuck with a terrible future if he didn't do anything. And you know, within the filth, that's a really good point. You have to think about it. Subaru was thrust into the middle of the worst situation. He was thrust into a situation where there's literally a madman trying to follow a script that Subaru has to try and get close to or match up with. Like, think about how aggressive your life is, that a guy's trying to force your life in a particular direction because he knows what the future is going to be. And then, you know, what does Satella do? She ignores that particular point and just tells Subaru to not be hurt and to not be sad, and that she wants him to treasure himself more. And you know, that's a great end goal. I think I agree with it. I think he should treasure himself more. But how do we get there when the world legitimately sucks? How is Subaru gonna treasure himself more without dying when someone's following the script of the ideal world? Like, this moment is great because it shows how unreasonable Satella is and how blind she is, while also showing how far gone Subaru is. Honestly, if you remove the moments like the one on the screen right now, Satella would have come out of this looking very unreasonable. Going into my bonus moment, Sloth saying that Subaru isn't a child. What? Excuse me? He isn't a child? Are you insane? He's 17. He is still a child. He still has an overflow of hormones going through his system. He is still stunted in both development and emotion. His brain isn't fully developed, and he was flung into a world where he could meet death on the first day. Sloth is incorrect here. This is the most insane thing that any of the witches say, because this is factually incorrect. And to my teenage viewers out there, I can imagine maybe you guys think that you are super hardcore adults, and you know what, I'm not gonna say it's impossible for a teenager to be more adult than an actual 30-year-old. I'm not gonna say that's impossible, but chances are, if you're in that situation, it's probably because you had a pretty storied life. It's probably because you probably experienced a lot. Really, age is just an approximation of how many experiences you are likely to have. But then think about Subaru, because Subaru is most likely not like you if you are a teenager who is essentially an adult. He's not like you. He's a kid that stayed in his room because he was afraid of going to school, because he was afraid of how he was going to be treated among his peers. That's who Subaru is. So when Sekhmet says that he is not a child, she is incorrect. Anyway, this is a great moment because it perfectly sums up how irrational the witches are. They aren't looking at the reality that Subaru's facing, nor the reality that he grew up in. And I mean, and when she says that he's a lonely child and she uses that to criticize him, I'm like, good stuff, I'm pointing it out, but that's exactly what he is. Did she not see, did she not get some of the memories from Echidna? Subaru is a lonely child. That's one of the main things that you get from his background story. One of the reasons he didn't go to school is because people stopped following him around. That's a critical part of his character development. For me, it's pretty clear Subaru's maladjusted. So why are you being a dick and criticizing a maladjusted person for being maladjusted? I feel this is equivalent to telling someone to stop being autistic when they are actually autistic. How unreasonable can one person be? So when Sekhmet criticizes Subaru for being a lonely child, it's like, he is a lonely child. We spent a whole episode establishing that he was a lonely child. Criticizing a child for being a child is insane. But that makes sense when you look at what the witches are talking about. My next top moment was when all the witches tried to help Subaru and fight it out. It was just kind of cool to see all the witches and all the different perspectives and how they wanted to help Subaru. I think it was neat just working through that. I think it was neat how Carmilla came in and was talking about the value of love. I think it was cool. I think it was cool to have Echidna all summing it up. It was a little bit more clear in the light novel because the light novel had a few more extra lines that they could devote to it. But when you see the witches fighting here, it was neat because you get to see the power hierarchy. Like when you see Typhon making her first move and everyone else freaks out, it's like there's not many people that can actually take out Typhon. Like Minerva is the weakest one of the bunch. So it was just really cool to see how that all worked out and how different mentalities came together. And it was cool to see Typhon being checked by Daphne. My fourth top moment was, of course, Roswell revealing his role in the plans, his hopes, his dreams, his machinations, his plot. Let me just make sure, because I got some notes for Roswell, and I don't want to lose out on what he said here. So the Roswell moment, we're going to talk about it a little bit more later, because the Roswell moment actually just shows us how it continues reinforcing how unreasonable the witches are being, because the witches are overlooking very critical things about Subaru's character as they're going about their berating him. But it's, again, I think it's unfair berating. But I think the biggest surprise for me was Roswell revealing that he sent the assassins in. Like, that sucks. That sucks. Someone on the live streams was saying that he was feeling it was going to be Roswell because of something that that the gut person, I forget her name, but the gut person had said about Subaru having the same eyes as her employer or something like that. And I wasn't sure. There's so many people it could have been, so I wasn't sure. But it was cool to actually see that Roswell's the one doing it. And that just brings us back to the unreasonableness of the situation. Everyone can say how they want Subaru to be in like the best situation, to have the best life, to treasure himself. But how is he going to do that when there is quite literally a madman hiring assassins to attack his own mansion? What do you expect Subaru to do? You put him in the worst situation. You put him in Cinderblock's shoes and you tossed him into the ocean, you dicks, and then you told him to swim. Like, what the heck what do you want from the kid? It's so unreasonable. Anyway, we find out more. Like, Roswell has a lot of things going on. I love the thing about the 400 years. That already tells us, okay, Roswell clearly has some history. And then Roswell talks about how he knows Echidna as well. So that informs you a little bit more. You have 400 years. You have Roswell and him having that little thing towards Echidna. I think it was a great moment. And Subaru, of course, breaks down in that moment. And this will be another point that we talk about in the general notes, because it just, again, reinforces the issues with Subaru. And then my fifth top moment is, of course, Otto's punch towards Subaru. And I'll also throw in, I love how Subaru's dragon went in to save him. I have another note about that at the end. Now, the reason I really like this moment is just because, like, it is, again, reminding you, Subaru, get your shit together. You learned the lesson. Come on. Don't just run away. Your friends are here to help you. You would have thought that Subaru learned the value of having parties back when he was fighting the whale. You would have thought he would have learned the value of that, but you know, it's Subaru, right? He's gonna forget everything. And you might be thinking, hey, it's mean for me to say that Subaru forgets everything, but this episode shows proof of it, like within moments of him learning the lesson. I like the moment though, just because Otto has been such a powerful force within this season. Like, Subaru knows that Otto likes him. Subaru knows that Otto thinks Subaru is his friend. And what did we get last time? Subaru laughed it off because, you know, Subaru was kind of numb to that, or just ignorant of that. He wasn't really thinking about it. So I love that Otto came back here and he's being reasonable. Otto looked like he had a plan. He looked like he had a preparation. I really hope this is going to be, once we get into like the second half of the season, that's going to be the final iteration. I hope Subaru doesn't have to die anymore. It would be lovely to just be great here, right? It would just be lovely. But those were my top 5 moments. Now let's just continue destroying the witches, because the witches, I think, are just some of the worst people in the world. Not Typhon though. Typhon, ironically, like, was pretty okay here. It's pretty much everyone that criticized Subaru. I think they're just the most unreasonable things of the bunches. So, you know, as we get into the general notes, what I said, like I said before, like, the biggest thing of value is that people, like, Subaru learned that people are gonna grieve. But, you know, functionally, what's that going to change in ReZero? Because at the end of the day, Subaru's probably still gonna die a lot. So what's gonna happen now? Like, whenever Subaru dies, is he gonna pat himself on the back and hug himself a little bit? Sure, that'd be cool. That'd be really cool. But because it's ReZero, because a gimmick, once it's here, it's gonna stay. Because this is like the central gimmick, that being the deaths, I'm not like, I don't think there's gonna be a functional difference in how we approach future arcs. And the rest of the episode shows that. But, you know, the episode also makes a big point about, especially with Otto's punch at the end, about the value of working together with others and fighting alongside them. And then it's like, you know, when the show is regurgitating that point, it's like, did we forget the majority of season 1 that ended with Subaru pulling off a massive collaboration? And did we also forget how badly that collaboration ended for Crush, who ultimately is suffering as well? Like, Subaru knows he can't do things on his own. This was a big thing that he learned back in, mind you, slightly rewarded, but he still learned a lesson about working with other people. The big thing that Subaru takes away from this is that he now fundamentally understands that people like him, actually. But how far does that understanding actually go? Like, should I have any faith in the lesson that Subaru learned? When you see, like, the way ReZero works, I would say no, not really. And you know what the best thing is that this episode gives me enough reason to not trust anything that Subaru learns. Because immediately after Subaru comes out of the dream, what's the first thing he does? He asks why his dragon saved him. Way to immediately devalue the lesson of what he was supposed to learn. When I see that scene, what I take away from it is, oh, Subaru is still forgetting his fundamental development. That's ultimately the challenge with ReZero. Subaru's development gets reset a lot in order to make sure that the story has struggles. It's just that when it comes to these particular situations, the writer is careful to reword the struggle or the problem of the volume slightly so that people don't notice it as easily. Like, really, think about it. It wasn't even a few seconds and Subaru already had to be reminded about the lesson that he just learned from the witches. You take this mechanism, the mechanism of Subaru forgetting things, and you expand it across the whole series, and right there you have the theme for Subaru's character. I mean, can you believe that Subaru forgot that Rem cared about him? Even though she had such a big moment, even though he still thinks about Ren? I mean, can you believe that he says this to his dragon after he learns that his dragon likes him? Which also, amazing that he has forgotten that this dragon has leapt into his way to protect him multiple times, usually ending in that dragon's death. If that's not a dragon liking you, then what the heck was that, Subaru? Can you believe that he follows up with, I never thought that you'd be the first one that I learned that from? Again, man, like, what was going on? Like, again, what was going through this kid's head when Rem confessed to him everything that she did? Now, mind you, you can always say that's a character flaw, that Subaru forgets the obvious facts. But if you say that, think about how miserable that's going to be going forward into the future if every time Subaru learns a lesson or an obvious fact that he forgets it. At what point do we like draw the line and say, like, Subaru, you have to start remembering stuff, bud? Now, honestly, I think we can all agree that Subaru needs to be incompetent, because that's the only real way that you're going to get the main gimmick of the story, the brutal kills. And that's what makes everything a lot more difficult. So when I ultimately see that the witches are telling Subaru to care about himself, it's like, okay, great, you know, next time Subaru goes to die because his bad decisions led him to a bad end, and I'm sure he's going to hug himself a little bit more after he gets out of that horrible death, whatever it's going to be. Like, honestly, how long is the new Subaru going to last before he runs into another hurdle? And interestingly enough, the episode gives us the answer. He won't last. He lasts all of it. Like, I assume he lasted like all of 10 paragraphs. What happens when Subaru runs into Roswell's craziness? Immediately, he meets a new stimulus, a new bit of information, and he freaks out. That's Subaru. That's who Subaru is. And what happens when he freaks out? He forgets everything he learns and needs to be punched in the face by Otto. That's who Subaru is. And it's just funny to see this always occurring. So again, you know, when the witches are giving Subaru the riot act and telling him how he should be better, even though I think they're fundamentally incorrect, it's like, you people don't know what you're doing. You people don't know what kind of person you're creating. Subaru is being rewarded for all the worst behaviors. At the end of the day, the thing that's going on in ReZero is the conflicting rhetorics. So many people have so many different ideas, and what you ultimately have to do is try to suss out who are the reasonable people and who aren't. At the end of the day, I'm always going to be on Subaru's side, because Subaru is going through the ringer here. Everyone sucks, they're all unreasonable, and when you look at the episode, what you ultimately see, especially when Roswell comes on, is a conflict between making Subaru give up his heart and not making him give up his heart. And then the witches get involved there, and they kind of play around with it and they muddy things up. But I think the witches are probably like legitimately the people you shouldn't be listening to unless they're making general observations. Like, Echidna ironically makes the really good point. Subaru wants to keep his heart and save people. That's ultimately the conflict where we're at here. As we know, Roswell wants Subaru to give up his heart. We want Subaru to keep it because that's what makes Subaru Subaru. But in keeping that heart, that's also what's going to guarantee that Subaru is going to suffer aggressively. And that's also what's going to guarantee that Subaru is going to keep making the same mistakes that he always does. And that's pretty much the most unfortunate part in all of this. It's unfortunate that because Subaru is naive and wishes for the best, that it's guaranteeing that he's going to make the worst choices that's going to end up in him having to repeat multiple things because he keeps getting the bad ending. It is legitimately a heart-wrenching situation to be stuck in. Subaru can say he doesn't want to suffer all as much as he wants, but the poor guy's being shot in the foot and no one's actually giving him any good advice. The witches are too unreasonable to touch and too deluded in their own perspectives, and Roswell's a megalomaniac, so whew. And then Amelia, poor Amelia, she's trying to deal with her own problems. What is she gonna do? It's really funny that at the end of the day, our best hope right now is Otto. But Otto has been actually like very reasonable throughout all of this. Otto is the one sane man in the room. Like, honestly, you know, Otto has failed before is the problem. That's the big problem. Otto's failed before. But I'm really rooting for Otto to come in with a miracle for next season, man. Like, holy crap. Subaru needs more friends. He needs better friends. Oh, poor guy.